Padre Pio looked at a man walking away from him one September afternoon in San Giovanni Rotondo and wept. Not quietly, the way a man weeps alone in a room with the door closed. Openly. His brothers in the friary saw it happen and stood still, not knowing what to do with it. The man who had just walked away was alive and well and perfectly unharmed. He was walking in the sunshine, perhaps already thinking about the drive back to Foggia, perhaps already returning to the ordinary texture of his ordinary life. He had come to the monastery out of curiosity, not devotion. He had spoken with Padre Pio briefly, been urged gently to use the opportunity of the confessional, smiled and politely declined, and walked away. And Padre Pio watched him go and wept. 3 weeks later, that man was dead. A road accident, sudden, without warning, without preparation, without final rites. And on the morning of the day he died, Padre Pio was found by one of his brothers, kneeling motionless on the floor beside his bed, eyes open and fixed on something that was not in the room, face wet with tears, unresponsive to his name being called 3 times before he finally turned. And when he turned, he said, "I saw it. I saw the exact moment." What Padre Pio saw in that vision, the exact moment that a soul realizes with complete and irreversible certainty that it is damned forever, is not what most Catholics imagine when they think about damnation. It is not a scene of fire or of punishment or of demonic cruelty. It is something far more devastating than any of those images. It is a scene of understanding, of total crystalline, inescapable clarity. And what Padre Pio described of it to his spiritual director in the days afterward, in words that were carefully transcribed and preserved, is something that the Church has rarely spoken about plainly enough to be heard. I am going to share it with you today, and at the end, I am going to give you the specific prayer that Padre Pio taught. The prayer, he said, with complete seriousness, provides protection against the one outcome that cannot be undone. But before I do, let me tell you something about why this matters to me personally. I spent years, more years than I would like to admit, living the way that many faithful Catholics live, doing the right things externally, attending Mass, reciting the prayers, maintaining the structure of religious practice, while something essential was quietly, gradually becoming more distant. It was not a dramatic crisis of faith. It did not announce itself. It crept in through the cracks of ordinary life, through the prayer that became routine, through the homilies I stopped truly listening to, through the slow replacement of genuine encounter with comfortable habit. And what I feared during those years was not damnation in any literal sense. What I feared was something harder to name, that I would reach the end of my life and discover that what I had taken for faithfulness was actually a very sophisticated form of going through the motions. That I would arrive at the moment of complete clarity and see the gap and understand too late that it had been there all along, widening so slowly that I had never noticed it opening. This is the fear that Padre Pio's testimony speaks to, not the fear of spectacular sin, not the fear of dramatic apostasy, the fear of the slow drift, the comfortable postponement, the life that looks from the outside entirely faithful and feels from the inside increasingly hollow, and arrives at its end without the genuine conversion that was always being saved for later. This is what Padre Pio wept for. This is what he saw in the man walking away in the September sunshine. And this is what I want to bring to your attention today, while the door is still open, because it is. It is still open. For every soul hearing these words, it is still open. In the autumn of 1959, in the small hill town of San Giovanni Rotondo on the Gargano promontory in southern Italy, a man named Giovanni Santi came to visit the friary of Santa Maria delle Grazie. He was 53 years old, solidly built, a textile merchant from Foggia who had worked hard through the difficult years of the war and the harder years of reconstruction, and had arrived at a point in his life of relative stability and genuine but unreflective contentment. He had a wife he loved in the habitual, unremarkable way of long marriages. He had 2 grown children, a son, Aldo, 28, who worked with him in the business, a daughter, Carmela, 24, recently married. He had a house in Foggia that he had purchased in 1951, a modest garden, a routine. He was, by any ordinary measure, a man whose life was going well. His relationship with God was the relationship of his generation and his background, present but formal, like a distant relative who is acknowledged at Christmas and Easter and whose existence is accepted without curiosity. He had received the sacraments at the appropriate points of his life. He attended Mass at Christmas and the Feast of the Assumption. He had been to confession perhaps twice in the preceding decade, both times at the insistence of his wife, who was more devout than he was. He was not hostile to religion. He simply did not think about it very often, in the same way that a man who is not ill does not think very often about medicine. He had come to San Giovanni Rotondo because his business associate, a man named Pasquale Visconti, had wanted to make the pilgrimage and had asked Giovanni to keep him company on the drive. Giovanni had agreed partly as a favor, partly out of a mild, uncommitted curiosity about this famous Capuchin who had been appearing in newspapers and on the radio for years. He wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He had no intention of going to confession. He had no agenda of spiritual seeking. He was a man who had come to a hillside monastery on a September afternoon because his friend had asked him to, and because the drive was pleasant. He stood in the church during Padre Pio's Mass, pressed among the crowd, and felt something. He told Pasquale afterward, in the car on the way out, that he had felt something during the Mass that he couldn't describe. Not a vision, nothing mystical or extraordinary, simply a feeling, a warmth, a sudden, specific sense of being noticed. He compared it, he said, to the feeling he had had as a boy when he was sitting at his mother's deathbed, and the priest arrived to administer last rites, and the room had changed in a way that was impossible to attribute to anything physical, but was also impossible to dismiss. He had been carrying that memory for 40 years without knowing what to do with it. After the Mass, through the good offices of his associate Pasquale, who knew one of the friars, Giovanni was given a brief private audience with Padre Pio. Father Pellegrino Funicelli was present as a witness throughout and recorded the conversation in a document that was preserved in the friary archives and later shared in partial form with Father Agostino da San Marco in Lamis, who was Padre Pio's spiritual director. Padre Pio looked at Giovanni Santi for a long moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, without accusation, but with a directness that left no room for comfortable ambiguity, "You have been moving away from God for a long time, not dramatically, not through hatred, simply by turning your attention elsewhere year after year, until the habit of turning away became your default direction. You are not aware of how large the gap has become because it grew gradually. But from where I am standing, I can see it clearly, and it is very large." Giovanni was shaken, not offended. Father Pellegrino's notes are clear on this, but genuinely shaken. He went still in the way that people go still when something true is said to them without warning. He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, in a voice that Father Pellegrino described as smaller than you would expect from a man of his physical presence, "Is it too late?" "No," Padre Pio said immediately. "No, not yet. That is why you are here today and not on some other day. There are no accidents in the spiritual life. The feeling you had during Mass this morning, the warmth, the sense of being seen, that was not your imagination. That was God reminding you that you exist to Him, still, despite the distance. He is offering you something today. He does not guarantee that the same offer will be repeated on another afternoon." He invited Giovanni to use the confessional, specifically and directly. not as a general suggestion, but as an immediate, concrete invitation to do it today, this visit, before he got back in the car and drove back to Foggia. Giovanni was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Father Pellegrino transcribed carefully because of the weight it would carry in retrospect. He said, "I'll think about it, Father. I'm not sure I'm ready. I'll come back another time when I've had a chance to prepare." "Of course," Padre Pio said. His voice, according to Father Pellegrino, carried no anger, only something that Father Pellegrino, searching for words later, described as a grief that was very old and very quiet, like the grief of someone watching a choice being made that they cannot prevent. "Of course, God respects your freedom always." Giovanni thanked him. He straightened his jacket. He said it had been an honor to meet him. He walked out into the September afternoon, and Padre Pio watched him go and wept. Brother Modestino, who was standing near the doorway and witnessed Padre Pio's weeping, would say later that he had never seen Padre Pio weep quite like that for someone who was still alive and walking in the sunshine. He asked Padre Pio what was wrong. Padre Pio shook his head slowly. "Pray for him," he said. "Pray for him specifically today. Not in general. Today." In the days that followed, Padre Pio asked several of his brother friars to pray for a specific unnamed soul. He did not explain further. Brother Modestino understood years later that this was a practice Padre Pio had when he saw something approaching for a soul, something he could not prevent, but could perhaps, through prayer, influence in its final seconds. He would mobilize the intercession of every person around him without explaining why. He gathered prayer the way a man gathers water before a drought he knows is coming. He could not stop the drought, but perhaps with enough water, enough prayer at the right moment, something could still be salvaged. A last movement of the will, a barely audible yes at the final threshold. Padre Pio believed in these last-second turnings. He had seen them happen. He had seen souls received at the very edge of the final moment that no human observer would have predicted could be saved. He prayed for Giovanni Santi for 3 weeks. He never mentioned him by name to his brothers, but he prayed. Hold on, because this is the moment in the story where everything changes. Because what Padre Pio knew, and what he could not tell Giovanni Santi without violating the freedom of a man who had made his choice, was something he had been given to see. Giovanni Santi died on the 7th of October, 1959, a road accident on the Via Appia between Foggia and Bari. His car crossed the center line. He was killed instantly. There was no priest present. There were no last rites. There was no final confession. By the time anyone reached him, he was gone. On that same morning, in his cell at the Friary of Santa Maria delle Grazie in San Giovanni Rotondo, Padre Pio was found by Brother Modestino shortly after dawn, kneeling on the stone floor beside his bed. Not collapsed, not fallen, kneeling deliberately, with the posture of someone who had chosen to be there, who was present to something specific and invisible. His stigmata hands were clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were white. His eyes were open and fixed. His face was streaming with tears that he seemed entirely unaware of. Brother Modestino called his name 3 times before he responded. When he finally turned, he was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "I saw it. I saw the exact moment." In the days and weeks following, Padre Pio described what he had seen to Father Agostino during their regular sessions of spiritual direction. Father Agostino, who had been Padre Pio's spiritual director for many years and who had extensive experience evaluating mystical claims, considered this account reliable. He transcribed it carefully and preserved it among his personal spiritual direction notes. He wrote in his own commentary, "Of all the testimonies I have received from this soul in 40 years of direction, this is the most sobering and the most important. I consider it a gift given to be shared, not hoarded. but it must be shared with the care that its weight demands. This is what Padre Pio described seeing. The first thing the soul perceived at the moment of death was not fire, not darkness, not any of the imagery of damnation that appears in medieval paintings, that fills sermons about hell, that the imagination reaches for when it tries to picture what follows death for a soul that is lost. The first thing the soul perceived was light, a light so total, so complete, so entirely unlike anything the physical senses of a living person can approach or conceive, that the soul's initial experience in it was not fear, but wonder. Padre Pio described it to Father Agostino as the light of complete truth, not warm, not welcoming, not the enveloping light of salvation that the tradition associates with heaven, but the light of absolute and impartial clarity, the light in which nothing can be hidden, nothing softened, nothing half seen, the light in which the soul sees itself as it actually is, sees God as he actually is, and sees the relationship between them, stripped of every comfortable approximation it had maintained in life. In that light, Giovanni Santi's soul saw his life not as he had experienced it from the inside, with all its rationalizations and comfortable self-assessments intact, but as it actually was, as God had seen it from the beginning, every moment of it, every choice, every offered grace and every turning away. It saw the distance, not as a spiritual concept, not as a theological abstraction, but as a specific, measurable, real thing. The gap that Padre Pio had tried to name in their 3-minute conversation 3 weeks earlier. And seeing it now, in the light of complete clarity, Giovanni Santi's soul understood for the first time how it had opened. Not through any single catastrophic decision. Not through hatred of God, not through deliberate apostasy, not through any of the dramatic spiritual failures that make for clear narratives. Through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small turnings, the prayer postponed, the invitation declined, the feeling at his mother's deathbed filed away as mere emotion rather than followed as guidance, the confession promised and never scheduled, each one in itself negligible, together across a lifetime, devastating. The second thing the soul perceived, and this Padre Pio told Father Agostino with a grief that Father Agostino said was visible in every line of his face even weeks after the vision, was love. God's love. Not in the abstract, not as a theological statement, but as an experienced reality, specific, personal, unwavering, and entirely present. Present at the moment of damnation, present in the very light in which the soul now stood. Padre Pio was explicit about this, and Father Agostino underlined it in his transcription. God had not turned away from Giovanni Santi, not at the accident, not at the walk away from San Giovanni Rotondo, not at the postponed confession, not at the morning prayers abandoned, not at any of the gradual turnings away of 53 years. God had never turned away. The love the soul now perceived was the love that had placed the feeling at the deathbed, the warmth in the room that a boy of 13 had filed away and never followed, the love that had arranged a business associate who wanted to make a pilgrimage, the love that had created the warmth during Mass that Giovanni had correctly identified as something real and inexplicable and had nonetheless chosen not to act on. The love that had put the invitation in Padre Pio's mouth 3 weeks before, not as a routine spiritual courtesy, but as a specific, personal, time-sensitive offer from a God who had been trying to reach this particular soul through every available channel for half a century. Seeing all of this completely and without the softening filters that living consciousness provides, the soul felt something that Padre Pio described as the most devastating element of the entire vision. Not fire, not punishment, not anything that can be framed as cruelty. The soul felt the full weight of having been loved immeasurably, and having slowly, without drama, without malice, through nothing more catastrophic than habitual inattention, chosen not to respond. And it felt this with the complete clarity of a soul that can no longer deceive itself about anything. No remaining rationalizations, no comfortable distances, no ability to say later or another time or when I am more ready. Only the pure, undiluted perception of what had been offered and what had been, again and again, set aside. This is what most people miss when they think about damnation. They imagine it as the consequence of extraordinary evil. Padre Pio witnessed something different, the consequence of extraordinary ordinariness, of a life that was not wicked, not malicious, not consciously opposed to God, but simply, chronically, habitually inattentive. A soul that had meant to get around to the essential things and had never quite managed it. Hold on. Because the third thing the soul perceived is the one that most surprised Father Agostino, and the one that has stayed with me the longest. The third thing Padre Pio described the soul perceiving was not its own suffering. It was the suffering of others, specifically the people whose spiritual lives had been shaped by Giovanni Santi's spiritual absence without anyone having noticed the connection. His son Aldo, 28 years old, who had absorbed his father's comfortable religious indifference as the default position of an adult man, and who would carry it forward into his own life without ever examining it, transmitting it to his own children in turn. His wife, who had wanted to deepen her own faith in ways that had felt excessive given the tone of their household, and who had quietly, persistently moderated her own spiritual impulses to avoid seeming strange to a husband who was not interested. A woman who worked in his textile shop, who had been on the edge of returning to the sacraments for 3 years, deterred each time she moved toward it by a vague ambient skepticism in her environment that she could not trace to any single source. The small, invisible, unintended, radiating consequences of one man's slow drift, spreading outward through every life he had touched, in ways he had never imagined and could not now undo. This, Father Agostino wrote, was what Padre Pio wept about in the weeks after the vision, not Giovanni Santi alone. The concentric circles of effect, the way one's soul's distance from God becomes, without anyone choosing it or noticing it, an invitation for the souls around it to maintain their own distance, the way children absorb not only the faith of their parents, but the quality of their faith, the depth, the sincerity, the genuine expectation, the way spiritual indifference propagates forward through generations with the same quiet inevitability as spiritual devotion. Father Agostino, in his transcription, paused here and added a note in his own hand. He wrote, "At this point in our conversation, Padre Pio stopped speaking for a considerable time. When he resumed, his voice had changed, lower, more deliberate, as though he were choosing every word from a very limited supply. He said, 'This is not what I would have wished to be shown. I would have preferred not to see this, but I was shown it, and I understand that I was shown it so that it could be carried forward, not as an argument for despair, as an argument for urgency.'" Father Agostino underlined this sentence 3 times in his notes. Urgency, not terror, not hopelessness. Not urgency, the urgency of a soul who understands that the time available for the most essential choices is specific and finite, and that treating it as unlimited is the most dangerous form of spiritual error. And finally, the 4th thing, the closure. The soul, perceiving all of this with complete clarity, the love it had been offered, the distance it had allowed, the concentric consequences of that distance, arrived at the perception that the moment of choice had ended. And Padre Pio was very careful about how he described this to Father Agostino, because he understood that this was the element most easily misunderstood. The moment of final choice is not necessarily the moment of physical death. Right up until the last instant of consciousness, according to Padre Pio, mercy is reaching. A genuine yes remains possible until the very end, frightened, imperfect, barely articulated but possible. He had seen this himself on other occasions, in the visions he sometimes received of souls passing from this world. He had seen souls turn at the very edge in the last available moment and be received. He had seen this. He insisted on it in the weeks of conversation with Father Agostino that followed the vision of Giovanni Santi, because he did not want the account of one man's damnation to become an argument for despair. The door was open until it was not, Padre Pio said, and only God knows the exact moment it closed, only God and the soul itself. What I saw was the moment after, the moment of understanding, the moment in which the soul perceived, with complete clarity and no remaining possibility of self-deception, that its final choice had been made. And that choice had been the gradual, accumulated, habitual choice of 53 years. I want to share something here that I have never shared in quite this way before. When I was nursing, I spent many years as a nurse before I retired and began my volunteer work with the parish. I was present at the deaths of many people. Most of those deaths I cannot speak about in any detail because the privacy of the dying is something I hold as a near sacred trust. But I can speak in general terms about something I observed repeatedly in that work. There is a difference. I have seen it clearly across many years and many deathbeds between the death of someone who has lived with genuine spiritual attention and the death of someone who has not. Not in the sense of external religiosity, not in the sense of prayers recited or sacraments received, something more interior than that, something in the quality of the soul's final moments. The people who had spent their lives genuinely turning toward God, imperfectly failing often but genuinely turning, seemed, in those last hours and minutes, to meet something, to recognize something. Even when they were not fully conscious, there was something in their faces that I can only describe as a response, a receiving, in the people who had spent their lives turning away, again, not through malice, not through dramatic rejection, but through the ordinary, habitual inattention that Padre Pio described. There was something else, not always terror, sometimes simply a blankness, a sense of arriving somewhere without preparation. I do not claim to know what happened to any of those souls. I cannot. But I thought about it then, and I have thought about it many times since in the light of Padre Pio's testimony, and I have come to believe with a depth of conviction that has only grown over the years that the preparation is the thing. Not the last-minute preparation of a deathbed, though that is still available and still real and should never be written off, but the daily preparation of a life lived in genuine attention to God. The prayer that is actual prayer, not habit. The conversion that is actual conversion, not performance. The yes that is said not once, dramatically, and then filed away, but daily, quietly, imperfectly, persistently. You just received what Padre Pio witnessed and carried privately for years. The testimony of what he saw at the moment a soul realizes it is damned. He shared it with Father Agostino in the privacy of spiritual direction because he understood it was too heavy to carry alone and too important to lose. Accounts like this reach people who need them, people who have been drifting, who have a person in their life who is drifting, who have recognized something of themselves in Giovanni Santi's comfortable indifference. Padre Pio believed that those who carry divine truth forward receive spiritual protection for doing so. The super thanks button below is your way of saying that this needs to keep reaching people, that the warning and the mercy in what you just heard needs to go further than this single video. You are part of that movement. Thank you. Now let me give you what I promised, something specific, something you can hold and use. Because Padre Pio's response to witnessing the damnation of Giovanni Santi was not despair and not paralysis. It was a turning toward what could still be done, for the living, for the countless souls who had not yet arrived at that final moment, and for whom the door remained open. Before I give you the prayer, I want to say one more thing about Father Agostino's transcription. He ends his account of Padre Pio's description with a single sentence that he said Padre Pio spoke almost as an afterthought, almost quietly enough not to be heard as their session was drawing to a close. The sentence was this: "The most merciful thing I can tell you is that for every soul I have seen arrive at that moment of finality, I have also seen souls who arrived at the last second of the last opportunity and turned. It is not comfortable, it is not peaceful. It is an ugly and barely coherent turning, but God receives it. He receives it with exactly the same love he would have received a lifetime of faithful prayer, because it is yes, and yes is yes." Father Agostino wrote afterward that he kept that sentence with him for the rest of his life. I have kept it too. He taught in the months and years after this vision a specific daily prayer, not a new devotion, not an elaborate ritual, something simple, short, and deeply intentional, a prayer he described as protection against the one outcome that cannot be undone. In its full form, as Father Agostino recorded it from Padre Pio's own description, the prayer goes like this: "You say it in the morning, before the day takes shape around you, before your mind fills with its ordinary contents. You say it like this: Lord Jesus, I do not know the day or the hour. I do not know whether I am living in the last years of my life, or the last months, or the last seconds. I ask only this, that whatever time remains, it ends with a yes from me that is genuine. Do not allow me to drift from you so gradually that I stop noticing the distance. Send me back to you whenever I begin to turn away, and at the moment of my death, whenever and however it comes, let there still be a yes in me. Let the last movement of my will be toward you. I ask this through the intercession of Our Lady, who never ceased saying yes, and through all the souls who died in your friendship. Amen." That is the prayer. Padre Pio recommended praying it every morning without exception, not as a formula, not mechanically, but with the actual meaning of the words deliberately engaged each time. Because a prayer said with genuine intention, even briefly, even imperfectly, orients the soul toward the thing it is asking for. It is not a magical protection. It is not an exemption from the need for genuine conversion, genuine sacramental life, genuine effort. But it is the daily act of a soul that has decided each morning to be aware of the gap whenever it opens, to resist the comfortable drift, to ask God for the most essential thing a living person can ask for, the grace to not run out of time before saying yes. Padre Pio also taught that this prayer has power for the souls of others, for the people in our lives who are drifting in the way Giovanni Santi drifted, not dramatically, not consciously, simply habitually. He said this explicitly, and Father Agostino recorded it. Our prayers for drifting souls accumulate. They do not disappear. They are held by God and released at the moments of greatest need, which are often the moments we will never see, the moments that happen inside the souls of people we have been praying for, when we have almost given up believing that anything will change. A grandmother who has prayed for a drifting grandchild for 20 years has built something through those prayers that is real and present and available to that grandchild even in the last seconds of his life, in a way she may never see in this world. Pray this prayer every morning. Pray it for yourself. Adapt it and pray it for the people you love who have been drifting, who have postponed the essential conversations with God, who have smiled and said they'll think about it and walked away in the sunshine. And pray it with the knowledge that you are not alone in praying it, that Padre Pio himself, who witnessed the vision that no one should have to witness alone, spent the rest of his life doing everything in his power to ensure that as few souls as possible arrived at that moment unprepared. He wept for Giovanni Santi. He wept in his cell on the morning of the 7th of October, and then, when the morning office was finished and the friary began its ordinary day, he went back to his confessional, because the living were still there. The door was still open, and there was still everything to be done. Before you go, I want to ask you something that I genuinely want an answer to, because it shapes everything we do here. Have you ever prayed specifically for the grace of a holy death? Not simply for a long life, not simply for good health, but specifically for this, a death at which the yes is still present in you, a death for which you are prepared. If you have never prayed this prayer and you want to begin, write below, beginning today. I will pray for each person who writes that, by name, using the prayer that Padre Pio himself gave, because you are not simply watching a video. You are part of a community of souls trying, imperfectly and persistently, to keep the door open for themselves and for everyone around them.